went up to Jerusalem. In the temple, he found people selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and the money changers seated at their tables. Making a whip of cords, he drove all of them out of the temple, both the sheep and the cattle. He also poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. He told those who were selling the doves, "Take these things out of here. Stop making my Father's house a marketplace." His disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." The Jews then said to him, "What sign can you show us for doing this?" Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." The Jews then said, "This temple has been under construction for 46 years, and will you raise it up in 3 days?" But he was speaking of the temple of his body. After he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed the scripture and the word that Jesus had spoken. The gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
Please be seated. In 2008, at a holy site in Jerusalem, a fist fight breaks out between Greek Orthodox and Armenian monks. A fist fight at a holy site. Now, after worship today, you can go to YouTube and find the the YouTube video of this incident in 2008. As I watched that video of these monks in a fist fight, in fact, one picks up a metal chair, slams it on top of another monk. It looks like WWE after a while. The video reminds me that sometimes life can be both funny and sad all at the same time. But it's also a reminder to me of just how easy it is for humans to transform something good into something bad. Maybe that's why we need sacred space in our lives more than we filled by God's holiness, rather than being infected by our own human sin. And we know from this true-to-life reference I just mentioned that creating sacred space is never really easy for us humans. I stumbled upon a little testimony this past week from an Episcopal priest. He was in Jerusalem for a theological conference, and he had some downtime. So he thought, I'm going to go visit this holy site, where these monks had this fist fight, and they're throwing chairs and all this other stuff. And his colleagues warned him about going to the site. They said, "You will discover that this site has an atmosphere," and I like this way they describe this, "an atmosphere of thinly veiled hostility." It has an atmosphere of thinly veiled hostility. Sounds like some of the congregations I've served over the years. They said, "You know what? There's going to be long lines of sweaty, smelly people pushing and shoving to get near to all those important spaces in this holy site." So they said, don't expect to have a very holy experience while you're at this holy site. Well, he went anyway because he thought maybe they're just misinterpreting or having a bad day. But then he discovered, they were right. In fact, he discovered in some ways that holy site was a lot like the temple in our gospel reading for today. And yet, he also experienced something else, that somehow in that atmosphere of thinly veiled hostility, Christ was indeed present. Because we know that Christ is always determined to be present in the mess and the mass of what we call human. And maybe that's the hope that we cling to today as Jesus attempts to kind of reset the temple. by reminding the temple then and the church now that what we do is always about the people. It's not about our rituals or regulations that sometimes actually make it more difficult for people to get in, but what we do is always about people. Some of you might remember that children's game where you put your hands together and you make a steeple, then you turn your hands upside down and you say, "There's all the people." I won't recite that for you because I can't remember it. But it's a great children's game that helps to remind us that it's important that we always prioritize what we do around the needs of others and not necessarily our own. That we prioritize what we do around the needs of others rather than necessarily our own. But to do that requires two things. And here's what we're going to talk about the rest of the time. It requires reverence and respect. Sacred space is created by reverence and respect. Reverence. You know, sooner or later in your life, you will acknowledge that God is more than just your best friend or that old man upstairs, but that God, or what some theologians call the other, is really the only one who can penetrate the darkness of this world and bring hope to the mess and mass we call human. In fact, Paul describes in the New Testament a created world, an entire creation, not just humans, but all of creation, yearns for, waits for God to act each and every day. And that's why we need sacred space in our lives, so that we can experience the healing of God's holiness. As we think about creating sacred space, I was drawn to an interesting spiritual discipline that the Japanese use. It's called forest bathing. Forest bathing. And what they do is they take employees that work in all of these high-tech businesses that are in Japan. They take them out of those office spaces and they take them out into the woods where they spend an entire day in the woods, forest bathing. And it's in those woods for a day where they are able to disconnect from their high-tech world and reconnect to the real world. A real world where we know what Barbara Brown Taylor knows, that the whole world is the house of God. That as you practice this forest bathing, you will discover again what Barbara Brown Taylor has discovered, that the whole world is the house of God. The whole world. But listening and knowing the healing that holiness brings to us in those spaces requires reverence. Reverence. Respect. We create holy space when we have reverence, but also when we have respect. Most of you have probably figured this out by now, but social media has made it very easy for us to be disrespectful of each other. We have created a world where we really no longer listen to each other. Instead, we like to talk over each other. And oftentimes we use speech that is disrespectful, even speech filled with hatred. You know, I look forward to the day when I can listen to a debate being conducted respectfully, but I think I got to wait a little longer. And yet, recent surveys say that, politics aside, the majority of Americans value restoring respect for one another because it's important. Why is restoring respect important among us? I think that's one of the things that Jesus is trying to do as he attempts to reset the temple. Create reverence to God, but also respect for each other. Some biblical scholars believe that that marketplace where he's driving people out of today, outside the temple, was filled with vendors who had found ways of cheating the pilgrims who had come that day to purchase their sacrifices and make those sacrifices as a part of being in that sacred space. That the vendors there were overcharging. And maybe that's one of the things that has Jesus really upset today. And as I was thinking about that dishonesty, I couldn't help but think that maybe some of that dishonesty exists because there's just a lack of respect for each other as human beings. And that void then is filled with disrespect, which then becomes dishonesty, which then eventually becomes injustice. I was reading an interesting little story this past week, kind of a disturbing one, really. In 2018, there were 15,000 sets of cremated human remains that were never picked up by family or friends. Either the family or friends had determined that it was just too expensive and so they weren't going to bother, or there was really no loving connection at all between the deceased and the family or friends, or folks were just too upset to go about doing that. But I also can't help but think that maybe some of it has to do with the fact that we just don't respect each other like we used to. And therefore, it is easier to disconnect. But I always tell people, you don't necessarily have to love them, but at least try to respect them. Holy space, created when we are driven by reverence for God and respect for each other. So we're going to close the message today with truck stops. I love truck stops. I love those big truck stops where you got fast food, multiple choices of fast food on one end, and then you got a restaurant on the other, and then you've got all kinds of good stuff in between. There's one south of here on I-35 just before you get to Albert Lee. My favorite one is a truck stop outside the Quad Cities on I-80 in Iowa. But I was reading about truck stops, and some of these truck stops are beginning to see these big rigs pull in to these big truck stops. And on the side of the rig, it says Mobile Chapel. I found that interesting. Mobile Chapel. In other words, it is an attempt to create a sacred space in an unsacred world. And one of the chaplains of this mobile chapel was asked, why do you do this? Why do you travel around your whole summer or whole year and just do this? And one chaplain said, deep down in every driver's heart, and you might apply this to your own life as well, deep down in every driver's heart, there's a desire to speak to someone who will not talk over them, but listen to them. And someone who doesn't judge them, but indeed accepts them. Deep down in every driver's heart, and maybe in our hearts too, there's a desire to speak to someone who listens and doesn't condemn. And so this mobile chapel has become a sacred space of hope for the lonely road warriors seeking some real comfort and a word of grace in their lives. Maybe that's why you're here today. So as we think about resetting temple, of being temple then and church now, maybe we take that mobile chapel and apply it to our own lives. That maybe, just maybe, today's church becomes a community center. We do some of this already here, where success isn't measured in square footage and weekly attendance. I think we need to kind of walk away from that for a while. But rather, success is measured in the ways that people find sacred space, where they discover reverence and respect in their lives, where they find people who listen and people who accept rather than condemn. Because we all know that the world feels a lot like the world of those truck drivers, whizzing by at 75 miles an hour every day. So pray that this always be a sacred space, driven by reverence and respect. Amen.